Lee Smith.
And Sean Franklin.
From Blood and Iron Martial Arts. And we're here to talk to you today about...
cutting sword reviews.
So, Sean and I, we are proven cutters. We've medaled many times in cutting competitions. Sean won a couple. He's an extremely good cutter, that's for sure. So today we're going to compare three swords. The ubiquitous Principe, or Alexandria. Same blade, different hilts. All right. And, you know, the Crecy, pretty much like the workhorse of HEMA cutting. And then, of course, the kind of newcomer, real newcomer, and the budget cutters with the cold steel.
Yeah, and so the cold steels we're talking about are the hand and a half and the Italian. They're fairly similar swords. The hand and a half is probably a better cutter overall, so that's kind of what we're going with. But, you know, they're both pretty good. They have been on the market for quite some time, but cold steel has just been kind of quietly, slowly working with people in the community, improving their product. So if you've seen one of these that was, you know, 5 years old or something, the product they're turning out now, and the one we're basing our review off of, is quite a bit superior.
Okay, so what this review is.
So this is not a full product review. I mean, spoiler, the Albion swords cost way more, and they're finished, and they have way better construction. That is what it is.
What this review is we're going to talk about and compare the pros and cons of three of the most common swords in the HEMA community that we see over and over in different cutting tournaments, finals, etc.
Yeah, and this is just purely from a training point of view. So you want to cut, you want to, you know, include that in your martial arts practice. You're looking for a sword. What are your most common options, and what are the pros and cons? If you want something pretty to hang on your wall, well, that's good. I encourage you to do so, but look at photos and make your own judgments. In terms of cutting ability, in this case, it lines up completely with price. Now, it's not always the case. Different swords cut to different abilities. Just because a sword's more expensive doesn't mean it cuts better, because it may not be optimized for cutting or may not be well made or whatever. But in this case, the price is pretty much correlated to cutting ability. So the Crecy cuts better than the cold steel swords, and the Principe cuts considerably better than either of them. Nice and simple in this case.
It's important to talk about edging, though, and a factory-edged Albion will easily be outcut by a properly sharpened cold steel. So take into account you're going to have to properly sharpen your sword when you get it. It's not just going to come out of the box and be an amazing cutter.
This goes for all the swords from any manufacturer, really.
The Principe. That's the first sword we're going to talk about. And it is easily the best cutter on the market. Its performance is excellent. But it's so good that if you don't have this sword and you're entering a medal round of a cutting competition, you are at a serious disadvantage. You do not want to be cutting against someone who's of equal skill to you with a lesser sword. And this sword really does set the standard for that. Another pro to this sword is that it is a better cutter even than a Brescia, in my opinion and experience. And the Brescia used to be the gold standard, but this is just a level above that. Also, if you're willing to take your time, you could theoretically pay this sword off after your down payment over a period of time. So Albion does offer a payment plan. However,
it doesn't come quickly. As we mentioned, the sword has a waiting list. It'll depend on how long, but you know, the shortest time is 6 months, probably more like a year. So that's not great. It's going to take some time to get your hands on one, even once you put your down payment down. In terms of sword wind, the sound the sword makes when it goes through the air, which is useful for training, it's good and bad. It's a very narrow bandwidth to hit it, but it makes a very sharp, crisp sound. So for an experienced cutter, it's very good. You have to be really precise and crisp in your strikes to get the sound, which is good. However, for a beginner cutter, it might be a little harder to hit that, where some more forgiving swords might have a less steep learning curve. And the big one, it's too good. Sounds a little weird, but if you really have a good edge on it, you can almost just hold it above your head, guide the edge into the proper edge alignment, and then it'll go through the mat. And, you know, you can learn to cut when you're not actually using proper cutting mechanics. And that can be a problem if that's the only sword you train with.
It's good enough that we don't allow any of our students, even our senior more instructors, to use this sword when they can't cut with a Crecy or cold steel first, just because we don't want to reinforce any potential bad habits.
And even, the senior instructors who do cut a lot, we tend to avoid using it because, we want to see the bad habits and how they make the cut fail, not just have a sword that corrects over them. So, and from a training point of view, it's not necessarily the best sword you can have.
Other better choices.
The Crecy. This has been the HEMA cutting standard for a long time, and for good reason. Very well-balanced sword, cuts quite well, especially in comparison to all the other swords at its price point or lower. And just like the other Principe, you have a payment plan available. So it's a pretty standard good sword that you can own, especially if you're in the market for a high-end sword. It's one of the most affordable ones.
Cons to the Crecy. 1, it's a very quiet sword. And because it's quiet, it's hard for a beginner to get that sword to make the proper sword wind noise. And because of that, it requires a lot more training. It's not as loud as either the Principe or the cold steel. Another thing, still it's an Albion, so you have wait times and a high cost. Both hard for a beginner person just getting into this. It's not super accessible. And it doesn't outperform the cold steel to such a degree that it justifies such a high cost for the beginning person. With that said, there's one more issue I personally have. It's a short handle. I don't really like short-handled swords. I find any guy in this school with wide shoulders, broad chest, also doesn't really like it, and most of the women don't really like the short handle either. Okay, so the cold steel. We're going to start with the pros. This sword is very affordable, and it's a big pro. It's so affordable, you probably could buy a cold steel and go to an event, which, if you're a new person, that's a pretty big pro. When you consider that you're going to get a lot out of taking workshops and competing and meeting other HEMA people, as well as having a sharp that you can do a beginner's cutting tournament with. Another pro to this sword, no wait time. There are several vendors in the US and Canada that can get you this sword tomorrow. So this is like another huge pro. Something else that you should consider with a sword like this is it's a very loud sword. And by that, we talked about the noise the sword makes, and with the other two, this sword is probably my favorite sword to give to beginners to make that cutting sword wind sound, as it gives your new people a good idea if their edge is in alignment or not, without having to go through tatami or water balls to do so.
Cons. Well, these mainly revolve around the fact that it's, a cheaper sword. And like we keep saying, you get what you pay for. So cold steel does a very good job with quality control, but still at the same time, the likelihood, well, it's not super likely that you might get, a defective model is a little bit higher. At the same time, the heat treatment on the steel quality is not quite as good, so it won't hold an edge for quite as long. Additionally, as we mentioned in the section for the other swords, it's not quite as good of a cutter as the other swords. Okay, but what sword should I buy? I just skipped to the end of the video. If you're looking for a sword because you're training martial arts, you want to validate your cutting mechanics, buy the cold steel. You're not going to learn anything different using all of these swords. Good cutting mechanics are good cutting mechanics. So if you're just looking to learn, well, you should buy the cheapest tool that's going to do the job for you. With the amount of money you save, you can probably cut 2 tatami mats every week for a year.
If you want to compete, and you want to compete at a high level, buy the Principe. Also, buy a cold steel as well for training, because by the time you get the Principe, you already have a lot of cutting experience behind you, and it'll make it that much easier.
If you're looking for a high-end sword, because you also just want a sword for aesthetic reasons, but you don't want to spend a ton of money, I would recommend buying the Crecy. It's a very good package for a sword at a very attractive price point for what you're getting, and it's a good cutting trainer.
If you own a school or finance your own club, kind of like myself, I'd recommend buying a couple cold steels. That way you get your students cutting right away. And that right there is one of the more important things I can stress.
If you see a different sword that we didn't list in this video, and maybe it doesn't cut nearly as well, but you really like that sword, it looks really cool, and that's what's going to motivate you to actually cut, learn some stuff about cutting and cutting mechanics, buy that sword. I mean, this is about learning to cut better, and if buying a different sword is going to make you happy and also make you learn, well, do that. This is about what you can do to improve yourself.
And regardless of the sword you purchase, you're going to need to put a good edge on it. A factory edge simply won't do. And for that, I strongly recommend checking out Carl's video on this. The link will be down in the description. Big thanks to our Patreon subscribers.
The 1 thumbs up subscriber and the 2 thumbs up subscribers. If you liked what you saw in this video, you want to learn more, we have our Patreon exclusive extra content. So in this one, we'll be talking about some other swords that we didn't mention in this video, and as well as the role of having sharp swords in training in general and how that can affect your school's culture and training.